Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 36. This is the first historical topic in which we go in depth in period 5, and we're going to start with manifest destiny. The theme that we're looking at today is geography and the environment, and the learning objective is explain the causes and effects of westward expansion from 1844 to 1877. Migration west, the peopling of the western regions, it wasn't always the United States. Up until 1803, the Louisiana Territory was the most western part of the United States. And in this period, we're going to see how the other areas that are on the West Coast are going to get filled in. So the desire for access to natural and mineral resources and the hope of many settlers for economic opportunities or religious refuge led to an increased migration to and settlement in the West. So mineral resources were a big thing. This is gold and silver. In 1848, by the time that California is part of the United States, there is a gold rush there in the northern portions of Northern California. People find gold there, and the word gets out, and so you have settlers going across the Great Plains and through the Great Basin into Northern California to try and sift for gold in the rivers. It was so plentiful that you would really just put your pan into the river and you'd sift out the water and you would find gold nuggets. It was that kind of plentifulness of gold that brought so many people to California in the 1840s, and it will eventually lead to it being accepted into the Union as a state as more people get there. In the Pacific Northwest, the fur trade is still really big. On the top left, you see a picture of Astoria, Oregon. The fur trade there was really lucrative. And because these areas in the West Coast began to populate a lot faster than the areas in the Great Plains and in the Great Basin, that is why they are admitted into the Union faster. Now, people also moved to the western part of the United States for religious refuge. So we've already talked about how the Mormon religion came about in the previous historical period as a result of the Second Great Awakening. And they were living in the Midwest around Illinois, and they began to experience discrimination. So they began to migrate to Utah with their leader, Brigham Young. So on the map on the bottom here, you can see their path now. This is called it's a historic Mormon trail, and if you want, you can hike it. The federal government maintains part of the trail so that any visitor can see it, and they end up in Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City grows as a large area for resupplying and staging their further migration past the Sierras into California. The increased migration, like I said, in the West Coast is going to result in the settlement of the West Coast before the Great Plains and the Great Basin. Manifest Destiny is a word that I'm sure you are familiar with. You probably learned it as far back into elementary school. This is advocates of annexing Western lands argued that manifest destiny and the superiority of American institutions compel the United States to expand its borders westward to the Pacific Ocean. So you can see that there is a lot of nationalism based on that reason for manifest destiny, why it became so popular. It was popularized by a journalist named John O'Sullivan. He advocated for the annexation of Texas and Oregon. You also have other famous newspaper and journalists that are promoting people moving out west. The journalist Horace Greeley, who we'll see once again as we get closer to the Civil War, he is often attributed with saying the saying of "Go west, young man," when a young reporter is asking him for advice on how to pursue more professional opportunities. So Manifest Destiny was fueled by nationalism, population increase in the East that was getting too crowded, so people were looking to spread out. Economic development, there are now more economic opportunities with the railroads, with the gold rush, and the technological advancement. So this is the railroads allowing people to get to western portions of the United States faster. This objective of trying to fill the United States to the Pacific coast is completed by 1848 at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture. But by 1848, the war ends. The United States gains all of the territory that includes California, Nevada, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, and of course, Texas is annexed peacefully. On the Pacific Northwest side, Britain makes a treaty with the United States over the contested territory in the Oregon Territory, and so we chop it in half, and the new boundary becomes the 49th parallel. So here is the breakdown of everything that we just talked about. So you see there, the Texas gained its independence in 1836 and then annexed in 1845. The Pacific Northwest, you can see, was a larger territory than just what the United States was able to settle for in the Oregon Treaty. When James K. Polk was campaigning for president, he was seen as the expansionist candidate, and he ran on the platform of 54-40 or fight, meaning that he wanted to have the entirety of the Oregon Territory added to the United States up to the 54th, 40th parallel line of latitude. The Mexican cession you see there includes California and other western states. And then finally, the Gadsden Purchase. This is after the annexation of the Mexican cession. This was a tiny strip of land south of Arizona that was purchased for the purposes of building a transcontinental railroad on a southern route. Later, after the Civil War ends, the United States is going to purchase Alaska from Russia. All right, so westward migration was boosted during and after the Civil War by the passage of new legislation promoting Western transportation and economic development. This means that the federal government was heavily involved in moving people to the West, that there were a lot of incentives that the US federal government was putting forth. The very first one is called the Preemption Act in 1841. This allowed people to move into federal land before it had been organized into a territory, let them live there, settle the land, improve it, build their houses. And then once the federal government organized those territories, they could purchase the land from the federal government at a reduced rate. And so it's made it legal for squatters to squat in federal land. The second piece of legislation is the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. It issued land grants to the railroad companies so that they could build a transcontinental line that would link cities in the Midwest to California. And the first transcontinental line was completed in the 1860s. You can see here the picture of two engines meeting on the same track at Promontory Point, Utah. So this is a city, or now it's a very small town north of Salt Lake City. And then finally, the Homestead Act of 1862. This was the attempt of the federal government to get people to move into the Great Plains region. It awarded 160 acres of government land for free to anyone that was willing to move to that land and improve it over 5 years. Now, the land that they were awarding was really just a random luck land. So if you got a bad piece of land that had no access to water, no access to transportation, then that was bad luck on your part. Even after the Homestead Act is passed, most people are still buying land from people who are speculators, people who had bought this land or federal land before that had access to transportation routes, had access to water, and then selling that at higher prices. But the homestead land was free for anyone that wanted it as long as they improved it for 5 years. And then finally, moving on to foreign policy, the US interest in expanding trade led to economic, diplomatic, and cultural initiatives to create more ties with Asia. So now that we have the West Coast filled in and we have cities and ports there, trade between the United States and Asia is going to be a lot faster. Before, trade had to go all the way around on the ocean, down across South America, around the bottom tip of South America, and then out to Asia. So that was really difficult. It took a long time. It did get progressively faster with the advent of steamboats, but it was still a very long process. So now that we have this increased access to Asian markets for trade, we want to make sure that all of the countries in East Asia are trading with the United States. And this is where Commodore Matthew Perry comes in. He is given the task by President Millard Fillmore to open up Japan for trade. Japan had closed off itself to any international trade previously. It had been over 100 years before they opened their borders. And Commodore Perry enters Tokyo Bay with a naval war fleet with cannons loaded and pointed into the city of Tokyo to show the strength of the United States, to try and convince Japan that the United States and Japan should become trading partners. Now, it's a very threatening way to start a trade relationship. Uh, Commodore Perry tells the Japanese people that he will return in 1854 to try and get their response of whether or not they want to start a trade agreement. And that's where the Treaty of Kanagawa comes into place. They sign the treaty, and now Japan is an ally or trading partner with the United States. All right, so that's it. Here's the recap. American settlers moved west for new opportunities. They began to believe it was destiny for annexation. The United States claims reached the Pacific Ocean after the Mexican-American War. The federal government encouraged migration through legislation, and then finally the United States took an interest in expanding its foreign trade and influence, especially in Asia, with Japan being your main example. Thank you for watching. Next lecture, we're going to be talking about the Mexican-American War, so I will see you then.